I have here two books written by Philip Beale, who is a naval captain from England. The first book refers to a trip that he circumnavigated Africa from 2008 to 2010, and it's called Sailing Close to the Wind. The second book to the right is a trip that he took from 2019 to 2020, where he sailed that same ship, the Phoenicia, from the Mediterranean Sea to Florida. And that book is titled Atlantic BC. And he used that title because it could have been Atlantic before Columbus or Atlantic before Christ. The next slide is a movie that goes into his history and how he made this happen.
Philip Beale, Sailing in the Wake of Ancient Mariners. Maritime adventurer Philip Beale has led a life of exploration, searching for answers to some of the great mysteries of ancient civilizations. Philip's remarkable adventures began when he was one of the few chosen for Operation Drake, a project that offered young people nautical challenges aboard the barkentine Eye of the Wind. The leg Philip sailed took him from Fiji to Papua New Guinea. While visiting Indonesia, Philip became fascinated by the possibility of ancient double outrigger ships depicted at the Borobudur temple sailing all the way to West Africa. This could explain Asian cultural, economic and religious influences that are found there today. After university, Philip's love for the sea led him to join the Royal Navy. Where for several years he served as an officer. Subsequently leaving Britain's senior service to embark on a successful career in the city, this would be a path that would one day enable Philip to pursue his lifelong ambition, exploring the world's oceans, researching ancient maritime cultures. Returning to Indonesia, Philip commissioned the construction of a replica vessel depicted in the Borobudur stupa. Leading the Borobudur ship expedition across the Indian Ocean, a migratory passage known to historians, Philip pushed on round the Cape of Good Hope to test his theory that Indonesians could have made such a voyage to West Africa. This was achieved, the expedition finally reaching Ghana. The Borobudur ship is now on display in its own dedicated museum at the Borobudur temple. This expedition increased Philip's knowledge of ancient migratory habits around the African continent. Researching history's father, Herodotus wrote that around 600 BC, the Phoenicians circumnavigated the African continent. Inspired by this knowledge, Philip then commissioned construction of his second vessel, Phoenicia. Her design was based on shipwrecks recovered and now housed in the Musée de Marseille. Phoenicia was built on an island off the Syrian coast, and in 2008, Philip and his crew of international volunteers set off to circumnavigate the continent. The voyage took 2 years to complete. The success of the Phoenician ship expedition's African circumnavigation prompted further ideas on possible Phoenician voyages. For a number of years, the question of whether Columbus was the first European to reach America has been queried. To challenge, if not refute this, Philip decided to attempt sailing Phoenicia across the Atlantic Ocean. In 2019, the Phoenicians before Columbus expedition set sail from Tunisia. The voyage took 5 months, finally reaching the Dominican Republic thence on to Florida in mainland USA. Under the auspices of the Heartland's research group, the Phoenician Ship Museum is now being constructed on the banks of the Mississippi in Iowa. The museum will house Phoenicia, featuring Philip's ship as a permanent reminder of the accomplishments of these ancient seafarers. Through these extraordinary projects, Philip Beale has pursued his research into ancient maritime civilizations and has inspired people from many countries in his unstinting search for knowledge. How and why these ancient mariners made their voyages and the influence that has had on contemporary life. Having expeditions celebrated in Eastern and Western museums is no mean feat, and surely testament to this remarkable man's courage in his relentless pursuit of understanding. Introducing a 4-part television series, Philip Beale, Sailing in the Wake of Ancient Mariners, will explore the life of this exceptional maritime adventurer, charting Philip Beale's beginnings from his early childhood when he dreamt of going to sea to the life choices he made that enabled Philip to become one of the world's great maritime explorers that he is today. Philip Beale, Sailing in the Wake of Ancient Mariners, is the story of a man, his dream, and how willpower and determination overcame the most difficult challenges to truly inspire and enlighten others with such revelations.
This is the review of the 2 expeditions that Philip Beale took on the Phoenicia. The first is in the Yellow Line, and that's where they built the ship in Lebanon, and then they sailed down the Red Sea over to the Oman Peninsula, a place called Salalah, and at the end of October they left. The first port of that they landed on for provisions was an island called Comoros. The capital city is Moroni. Then from there they went down to the tip of Africa, where the oceans are pretty rough, and also the wind then took them toward North America. They wanted to circumnavigate Africa, but they were able to redirect the ship through that single mast and be able to arrive back in Beirut in 2010. And then 9 years later, they decided to take that same ship and sail from Tunisia and then go all the way over to landing in Fort Lauderdale. Now, once they landed there, that was during COVID, and also there was a hurricane, and that ship actually was ported there, but because electricity was no longer viable, that pump that was taking the water out of the ship did not work, and therefore the ship sank. So therefore that ship is in a condition that needed to be repaired. So we, as a group of Heartland Research Group, decided to take that ship and purchase it and make a museum from it. So the ship is being reconstructed in Montrose, Iowa, right across from the Nauvoo Temple. It's going to be called the Phoenicia Museum. It's owned by the Heartland Research Group, and this is just an example of how they're reconstructing the pieces that were purchased on the ship, and eventually all of the pieces have been assembled, and then the museum will be built to house the replica 600 BC technology Phoenicia ship. This is a map of how the Phoenicians were able to create port cities throughout all of the Mediterranean. And again, if you go to the right on the map, you can see what's called Phoenicia, and it goes on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. And you'll see a city called Sidon and Tyre. Those are the 2 main cities. And from those cities, they were able to have ports throughout all of northern Africa and through the islands. And if you notice here, we have the island of Sardinia, and that's important because they found Phoenician writing on that island. This is a rock that has some inscriptions that are the early Phoenician scripts. It's called the Norris Stone. It's found in Sardinia, Italy in the 18th century. It is the most ancient Phoenician inscription ever found outside the Phoenician heartland, and they reckon that this is about the 8th to 9th century BC. It is indicative of the expansive trade network that Phoenicians established in ancient times. This is now being housed in a national museum in Italy. This is a map of the Phoenicians before the Columbus expedition. And Captain Philip Beale thought that if anybody could have reached America before Columbus, it certainly would have been Columbus. So they left Carthage, Tunisia in September of 2019, eventually worked their way over to Tenerife, which is an island in the Canary Islands. And from there, they went all the way over and landed in the Dominican Republic at the end of December. And then in February, they arrived in Fort Lauderdale. On the island of Tenerife, they have some rocks that have some inscriptions. And if you look in the middle there, they have these characters that have been inscribed on the stone. And if you look at the ancient Berber or vertical script, which is based on the Phoenician Punic script, with some influence of the Southern Arabian and Northern Arabian scripts, there is a person by the name of Michel Boutios out of Ontario, Canada, that was able to take a look at those inscriptions and said that it appears to have the name Zarahemla on it. And so that's intriguing, isn't it?
My current research focus is the culture and society of the Phoenicians. This is an ancient group of people who are known to us indirectly from the Bible and from classical Greek sources. Ironically, even though the Phoenicians perfected the alphabet and quite literally taught the Israelites and the Greeks how to read and write, very few of their own writings have been preserved because they were not inscribed on clay tablets, but on perishable organic materials like papyrus that have long since disintegrated in the humid climate of the Phoenician cities, with no chance of preservation as in the dry desert climate of Egypt, and with no one to copy and recopy the Phoenicians' vast literary output in subsequent centuries, as was the case with the ancient Hebrew and Greek writings that we have at our disposal today. So despite the enormous cultural impact of the Phoenicians in their own time, most of what we know about them is inferred from the gravitational pull they exerted on their Mediterranean neighbors, and is from the perspective of their rivals, especially the Israelites and the Greeks, who perhaps did not understand them fully and who were often actively hostile to them. But we do know enough from Greek and Hebrew sources to say that the Phoenicians were famous as seafaring merchants who accumulated great wealth, and archaeological excavations have shown that they were intrepid explorers who left their homeland in what is today Lebanon and northern Israel, and sailed throughout the Mediterranean, establishing colonies in Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and Spain, in the green areas shown on the map in this slide. We now know that the Phoenician colonies in the Western Mediterranean predated and set the pattern for the much later Greek colonization efforts. In the top left of this slide, you can see an ancient sculpture depicting an Iron Age Phoenician sailing vessel. And in the bottom left, there is a photo of a modern replica of a Phoenician ship, which sailed last year from the Mediterranean Sea and across the Atlantic all the way to Florida, proving that these simple vessels were seaworthy and could undertake long voyages. But who were the Phoenicians? The simplest answer is that they were the Iron Age descendants of the subset of Bronze Age Canaanites who occupied the central part of the eastern shore of the Mediterranean in what is today Lebanon, northern Israel, and western Syria. The Bronze Age is the name given by archaeologists to a cultural period that lasted in this region for more than 2,000 years, from about 3500 BC until 1200 BC, or as late as 1130 BC, according to some scholars, who date the end of the Bronze Age in Canaan to the final withdrawal of the military forces of the Egyptian pharaohs of the New Kingdom, sometime around 1130, marking the end of more than 3 centuries of Egyptian imperial rule during the late Bronze Age. After the Bronze Age was the Iron Age, from 1200 or 1130 BC, depending on where you set the dividing line, until about 600 BC, when the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar invaded and devastated the entire region, ushering in drastic social and cultural changes. In the map on this slide, the Phoenician heartland is shown in green. It is a long, narrow strip of land bounded by the sea on the west and steep mountain ranges to the east, where there were dense forests in ancient times that were famous for tall cedar and pine trees, trees that were highly prized as building material for palaces, temples, and other elite dwellings, and for building ships. In addition to timber, the products traded by Bronze Age Canaanites and by their Iron Age Phoenician descendants included wine, olive oil, and purple dye. The famous Phoenician purple was a vivid and durable dye extracted from murex seashells. Murex purple dye was much sought after by ancient elites and was exported far and wide by Phoenician merchants. It is symbolic of their skill in crafting luxury goods and symbolic of the wealth that they gained by selling these goods. Before we talk about the Phoenicians themselves, let me make a few more remarks about the Bronze Age Canaanites from whom they were descended. We know quite a bit about the Canaanites in the period from 2000 BC until 1200 BC, which scholars call the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. There are some written records and a lot of archaeological evidence, as well as depictions of Canaanites in Egyptian art. On the left in this slide is a modern artist's depiction of a scene of Canaanites coming and going in front of the monumental gate of the city of Ashkelon, on the southern coast of modern Israel, shown in purple in the map on the right. I was involved in excavating the city of Ashkelon, and the illustration shown here is quite accurate with respect to the monumental ancient mud brick architecture, and even with respect to the hairstyles of the people and their multicolored clothing, reminiscent of the biblical character Joseph and his coat of many colors. These details are taken from ancient Egyptian depictions of Canaanites. The black and white drawing is a copy of an Egyptian relief that shows a bearded Canaanite wearing a multicolored wraparound garment who has disembarked from a ship and is delivering goods to a seated Egyptian official. But if the people who lived along the central coast of the Levant during the Iron Age, in the period after the Egyptian imperial forces withdrew from this area around 1130 BC, if these people were just the descendants of Bronze Age Canaanites, why do we give them a different name and call them Phoenicians instead of Canaanites? Indeed, in the Hebrew Bible, they are called Canaanites, or more commonly, Sidonians or Tyrians, using the names of the most important Phoenician cities, Tyre and Sidon. There is some evidence that they thought of themselves as Canaanites, although their primary identification was in terms of which city they belonged to, whether it be Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, or whichever city was their home. It was the Greeks, as non-Semitic speaking outsiders, who called them Phoenicians. Going back to the previous slide, we can see the location of Tyre, marked out here on this map, in what is today the southern part of Lebanon, not far north of the Israeli-Lebanese border. And Sidon, north of Tyre, the other main city of the Phoenicians, although there were several others that were quite important and distinctive in their own right. In any case, Tyre and Sidon were the two most important cities, and they've been continuously occupied since antiquity and still go by the same names. The primary self-identification of the Bronze Age Canaanites and of their Iron Age descendants, whom we call Phoenicians following the Greeks, was always with their home city rather than with the larger linguistic and cultural and regional grouping.
If anyone could have done it before Columbus, that is, sailing to America, it was the Phoenicians, said Captain Philip Beale. He says the following: Phoenician boats sailed easily from Tyre and Sidon, two leading Phoenician cities that produce murex purple dye, or Tyrrhenian imperial dye, both now in modern Lebanon, to Gibraltar and Tangier. He says That 2,000-mile voyage is about the same distance as across the Atlantic. And you can see that I have displayed some of the colors of purple from that shell that they were able to find throughout the coast, and were able to extract that dye. And they made a lot of wealth from that process, because that became the color of royalty. We learned that the Phoenicians were responsible partly for the Bronze Age, and the bronze is made up of 88% copper and 12% tin. Where are the sources of this copper and tin? Well, mining in Cornwall and Devon in the southwest part of Britain began in the early Bronze Age, around 2150 BC. Tin and later copper were the most commonly extracted metals, and that's kind of the location of where Cornwall and Devon is. Now, varied Phoenician types of stone anchors are either there's no hole, which means there's a grooved waist, there's one hole, there could be two holes, one for the rope, or three holes. And boat anchor types that have been found throughout North America seem to replicate these types of Phoenician boat anchors. So in Florida, there's a single hole, same thing in Kentucky. Lake Superior, they have found these grooved waist anchors. Ohio, you can see that there's a single hole, and in the Pearl River, Mississippi, there's a two-hole anchor. The Mississippi, Ohio, Allegheny, and Missouri rivers were the common waterways for transportation of the Hopewell culture. So how did these Mediterranean Phoenician boat anchors get here? So Copper Country is in the Keweenaw Peninsula, Michigan. So they have found the boat anchors of the groove type in that area. And here's a picture of a large piece of copper called the world's largest float copper, which is glacially transported copper in Marquette, Michigan. It's in the Lake Superior portion near the Keweenaw Peninsula. And so therefore we know that the Phoenicians were there because of the boat anchor, and we know that the type of copper and tin that they're getting can be found in that area. So one of the big city ports in the Phoenicia territory would be Sidon, and that's a name that you'll see throughout the Book of Mormon, if you are readers of that book as ancient scripture. And so therefore one of the main rivers throughout the text of the Book of Mormon is the River Sidon. So tradition has it the Lenape, which are the Delaware people or nation, according to their traditions handed down from them by their ancestors, resided many hundred years ago in a very distant country in the western part of the American continent. And they determined to migrate eastward, and accordingly set out and as a body, and after a long journey and many of their nights that they camped out, they went ahead and found the place called the Mississippi River. Now the native name is Nanasi Sipu, and the name Nanasi means a fish and Sipu means a river. So if we go back to the Hebrew meaning of Sidon, it means fishery or fishing port. So there is a connection there. The Phoenician alphabet is the root of Paleo-Hebrew. So off to the left, there are some symbols of what Paleo-Hebrew would be. And if we look at the parent systems, you have the Egyptian hieroglyphs, then you have the Proto-Sinaitic script, then from there the Phoenician alphabet, and then down from there you've got the Paleo-Hebrew. So if we look at some of the symbols that we see in the Paleo-Hebrew, they are also seen in the Phoenician scripts. So here's another one. Here's another one here. And so you can see that there's quite a strong correlation of the Phoenician alphabet being derived, being the one that derives from the Hebrew alphabet. Off to the left is a stone inscription with some inscriptions. It's called the Gezer calendar. It's a small limestone tablet with an early Canaanite inscription discovered in 1908 by an Irish archaeologist, R.A. Stewart Callister, in the ancient city of Gezer, 20 miles west of Jerusalem. It is commonly dated to the 10th century BC. Scholars are divided as to whether the language is Phoenician or Hebrew, or Proto-Canaanite or Paleo-Hebrew. So slate, copper, and clay relics have been found throughout North America, especially in the Midwest. And the question is, are they genuine or fake? And to the right, you can see just one of thousands of examples where they have found these slate and copper and clay relics that have these inscriptions and images. So here's the quote: "There is a principle which is the bar against all information, which is a proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt before investigation." And that's from William Paley, who is an English clergyman and philosopher. And this is quoted because most of the archaeologists who have looked at these thousands of artifacts have deemed them as fake. Now we have a picture of a person by the name of Henriette Mertz, and she wrote a book called The Mystic Symbol. It's the mark of the Michigan Mound Builders. Now, who is she? Well, she's a graduate of Chicago's Marshall Law School. She's a renowned courtroom expert in handwriting analysis. She worked in the U.S. and Canadian patent offices. She was a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy in World War II. She is a code breaker for the U.S. Cryptography Department. She has 32 years of research to write the book that you just see there, and she uses 340 sources. She examined over 3,000 artifacts, and she is the one that coined the phrase, the mystic symbol. And this book was printed after her death in 1986. And what is her conclusion? Her conclusion is that these artifacts are not fakes. An example of her writing and her research is the following. What might well prove to be one of the most important of the Michigan tablets shows a schoolroom, an assembly room or church of some sort, which is plate number 7 to the upper left. A teacher who looks to be a woman stands beside a lectern. Placed on the lectern is a scroll on which writing appears and to which she is pointing. With a pointer in her other hand, the instructor points to a blackboard, apparently indicating that information on the blackboard corresponds to that on the scroll and had been transcribed on the board so that all might read at one and at the same time. As can be observed, information written on the blackboard was set down in several different types of characters, apparently to accommodate a mixed group. In passing, it might be noted that in synagogues from ancient days, the Torah, or sacred scroll, traditionally combined with a characteristic pointer such as noted here. From the nature of the material on the blackboard, it might be inferred that the lesson being taught was that of their migration. The history of the migration for a ship can be seen. If that assumption has merit, then this plate alone might well give us the answer to the entire collection of the Michigan relics. Are there evidences of any Phoenician scripts found in the Heartland relics? I have some samples here to show you that there's quite a variety of different images and scripts that are found. And I've circled that mystic symbol, which looks like 5 nails. It's similar to a Roman crucifix nail. We also see the all-seeing eye description up here. That's been found also in Cahokia artifacts. There was a presentation that was done on a website that I went to called The Hoax or History that refers to these relics. In their conclusion, the inscriptions are largely a horrible mixture of Phoenician, Egyptian, and ancient Greek characters taken at random from a comparative table of alphabets such as is found in the back of Webster's dictionary. Now, the problem with that quotation is that during that time that these relics were being found, there was no such thing as in the back of Webster's dictionary, these inscriptions. They were not known at the time, or the Webster's dictionary did not print them because the Webster's did not know of them at the time. Here's another example of a copper plate. It appears to be the Ten Commandments because you can see little dots, 1 dot, 2 dots, 3 dots, so forth down vertically all the way over the 10 dots. We don't know if this is the Ten Commandments, but it certainly looks like 2 stone tablets, although this is made out of copper, and it appears to have something to do with deity because you have the mystic symbol there. Wayne Maid was giving a presentation a few years ago where he describes an event where he met up with a Ojibwe native who said to him that that mystic 5-nail symbol was the name of their god, and it means Yod He Va, and so the Hebrew letter Va is in the shape of a nail, and that description that you see on these tablets looks like again the Roman crucifix nail, and so Yod He Va is always gone because it's in Hebrew from right to left, and it's the name of Jehovah. So the John White collection is it's a series of about over 500 artifacts that came from a cave known as Burroughs Cave. It was Russell Burroughs who claims that he went into a cave and found these hundreds of artifacts that had inscriptions, and this is just one. This is a Phoenician, appears to be a Phoenician single-mast sailing ship with a Phoenician script to the right of it, and it's found again in that Burroughs Cave, which is located in the southern part of Illinois. This is another one of those artifacts, and you can see that it looks like a Phoenician ship. You've got the horse's head, just similar to what Philip Beale did on his ship. He created the same symbol, which is a Phoenician symbol of a horse, at the beginning of the front of the ship. Also on their sail, it has a menorah, which means that they had a Hebrew connotation, even though the Phoenicians were not. They might have had on board Hebrews on this particular ship. Here to the left is another one for the Burroughs Cave, where we see beautifully formed Phoenician letters. And to the right, we have a artifact that shows what appears to be the Great Lakes, and it appears that they had knowledge of the Great Lakes because they are depicting the shape and the size fairly well in proportion, and on this artifact are Phoenician scripts. So all of this combined shows that the Phoenicians were potentially the ones that came here before Columbus, with the Phoenicia being placed in a museum across from Nauvoo, Illinois, on the Mississippi River, which is, we think, the Sidon River. And having these artifacts on display will show that there's a connection between the two migrations that occurred in the Book of Mormon. You had Lehi's group coming perhaps around the African coast, and then the people of Zarahemla that had the history of Mulek coming over perhaps on a Phoenician ship. Thank you for taking the time to take a look at this video.